Welcome to Sunday Morning Bible Study with Pastor Zemke. This podcast is the weekly, digital way to be involved in the Prince of Peace Bible study. Whether you're at home, in the car, or wherever else you might be, we invite you to join us in studying God's Word. Today's lesson comes from Mark chapter 3.
Hello, and welcome to our continued, what is now becoming podcast for the Gospel of Mark. I'm going to try to do something different today and get the text up on the screen. If this doesn't work, you'll never see it and be spared from bad technology use by me. If it does work, we might try to do this in the future, unless it ends up being an enormous amount of work. But we will see how this goes. So we're back in Mark chapter 3, verse 7. And if you have a Bible, go ahead and pull it out. Sometimes it's better to have it in our actual lap than it is to have it sitting out and gathering dust. It's also visually a little easier to see how the text is broken up by the publisher. This is sometimes interesting and helpful or unhelpful thematically, as we'll see. So last time, if you tuned in for Mark chapter 2, verses 18 through chapter 3, verse 6, this is a big teaching chunk about how Jesus is Lord of the Sabbath and how God and his new ministry is going to break the old covenant, and having the Son of God here present on earth is going to be more important than anything else. Even our own human understanding of the covenant, our own human understanding of the rules. We need to know the rules, but also we need to know who's in charge of making them, and that's Jesus. So then we have our text today, and I'm going to try to just do chapter 3, verses 7 through 19. And so there's a two-part chunk here, crowds following Jesus, and then the appointing of the 12. And so I want to do a little more literary analysis of what's going on here before we dive in. So we've got this big teaching chunk that we just had in the last one, and now we've got what seems like housekeeping orders, and seems like kind of a, well, where do you put it? And for people doing biographies or people doing this kind of work, Gospels, that's kind of a real question. Because you don't necessarily know where to and how to organize absolutely everything. And sometimes you'll actually see this in good textbooks. They will actually have a section and work in, now you need to know this other thing. It's not directly related to anything else, but you can't actually know and go forward without knowing this stuff. And so we're tempted to actually look at verses 7 through 19 as kind of a miscellaneous catch-all. And in one sense it is. In one sense, right, we're going to continue this theme of Jesus and the crowds, but some more interesting things are going on here, building the tension and building the story. And then in kind of a housekeeping, miscellaneous sort of a way, Mark does need to tell who the 12 apostles are. But we'll see Mark's fingers running through Scripture and getting us a little bit more in depth here. Literarily, though, this chunk from verse 7 through verse 19 serves as a breath. And why we need a breath here is because this idea that Jesus is Lord of the Sabbath, that the Son of God has come into the world to rewrite the law and the prophets, or not rewrite, right? That's kind of what we expect, but to fulfill and to rewrite our assumptions is a better way to put that and talk about that. So that's a really big idea, and it's going to be really transformative for the Jewish Christians, the first Christians, and it's going to actually be something that kind of needs to trickle out through the rest of the pagan world. And so when Mark takes his gospel out on the road, and again, I'm going to shamelessly say here that we are in going to be talking about this in terms of Markan priority, right? Mark wrote first. Mark wrote very early. Mark may have written as early as 40 or 45, that early. And if you like Matthean priority, that's kind of too bad. I'll deal with that. I don't think that's actually a decent idea at all. We've talked about that in our in-person meetings with Bible study and why we would not prefer Matthean priority. But there are some people out there who don't are for Matthean priority, or think Matthew wrote first. The Catholic Church throughout much of history, and some other people out there. So if you end up listening to this Dr. Veltz, too bad. We can have a beer and you can try to convince me again. Lots of luck. So Mark writes this, and when he goes on the road, he does need to be able to establish. He does need this section here, this next section literarily, that we'll have with the calling of the 12, because those names are out floating there, and you do need, if you're going to be a Christian, to be able to recognize that Thaddeus was there from the beginning. And there is a little foreshadowing, right? And when we get to the next slide, we'll talk about that foreshadowing and what's going on there with Judas. So then locally here for this particular text, all of Jesus' teaching and all of his miracles have given him a reputation. And so he has had to withdraw. So Jesus withdrew with his disciples to the sea. So he takes the crowd with him. This is not the 12. The disciples are everyone who's following him now. And a great crowd followed. So there's the followers who know and love him, and then there's the people who are busy coming to see him because he's interesting, but they haven't quite signed up yet. So the visitors to church, as it were. They followed him from Galilee and Judea and Jerusalem and Idumea and from beyond the Jordan and from around Tyre and Sidon. Okay, so I want to stop there for just a second because when we go back and read about John the Baptist as the forerunner of Christ, that's his title in the Eastern Orthodox Church, and I think it's a good title to talk about John the Baptizer. John's famous locally around Jerusalem and southern Judea. But here Jesus is pulling from everywhere. He's pulling from Galilee and Judea, Jerusalem, Idumea, which is the southern part that used to be called Edom. The Edomites way down south, that's that area. From beyond the Jordan and from the north, Tyre and Sidon. So Jesus pulls from the four kind of points of the compass, except from, there's nobody in the Mediterranean Sea. But Jesus, partly, this is going to be thematically, Jesus is a bigger deal than John the Baptist. And so while we're taking a little teaching break here to catch our breath and let us stew on the whole idea of Jesus is bigger than the 10 Commandments, and Jesus can do whatever he wants, and Jesus can rewrite the rules the way God intends them, we're actually going to fill in some other information, that's not inconsequential. Remember how Mark starts his gospel. This is the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. And Mark starts his gospel intentionally with the Son of God. And so it's not for nothing that he's saying Jesus is a bigger deal than John the Baptist. And in kind of a historical point for the boomers out there and the old Xers, Jesus is a bigger deal than John Lennon. So, sorry, John. So he's getting pressed and he's having to get into this boat. And this boat is kind of a way to keep himself out. The word here is not following by crowds. The word really is, a better sense to translate this would be that he's getting mobbed. He's getting pressed and pushed. And the idea of the Anglo-Saxon English idea of lining up for everything and waiting your turn, that's not a thing in the ancient world. No, they do mobs. They do pressing and crowding and pushing, and you'll see that later with the woman healed from bleeding. So that's why he gets in the boat, and they push out a little bit from shore. So we've got Jesus, we've got a huge crowd, and people are mobbing him because he's interesting. At the end, so we've got this not so subtle Jesus is great sort of thing at the beginning, right? And at the end, we have another kind of 2x4 to the head. Jesus is the Son of God, because as he's casting out demons and healing from the boat, or from his position as he gets away, that there are the idea here is that the evil spirits come out and they fall down before him and cry out that he's the Son of God. So all the way through this chunk, it's another way to reinforce Jesus is a big deal because he's the Son of God. And so while we're letting it mull over that whole idea about the covenant and new wine into old wineskins and all of those things, Peter, by way of Mark, they are reinforcing this idea that Jesus is God. And so these doubts that come up from this bigger teaching session that we had last time, he's trying to put these to rest by reasserting the authority and the divinity of Christ. So it seems like we've got to stick this little thing somewhere, but how do we do and what do we do with it? Well, let's put it here because we need to take a break cognitively and let this sink in, the import of the fasting stuff and Lord of the Sabbath. But at the same time, you're going to be having anxiety as a reader. You're going to be having like, I'm not sure about this guy. I don't think I really like this. And then we're going to need to reinforce that and tell you, no, it's okay. It's okay that he did this because he's God. He's the Son of God. He can do these things. We'll take a little break from the teaching and just let you see other divine sorts of acclamations about him, right? And St. James backs this up in 249, if I'm not mistaken, where St. James says, even the demons believe in God and they shudder, right? And you can see the demons shuddering here as well. So then finally we get this back, this I'm a secret Christ, though. And it is authentic to the ministry of Jesus because he has this sort of, I'm going to have a 3-year ministry, and if you guys blow who I am in year 1, we're sunk. So he's telling everybody, don't say that, don't do that, don't tell anybody about this. This is a continuing theme in terms of the progressive revelation of who Jesus is. You might, depending on how much PBS you watch, again, I try not to watch PBS on religion because kind of I'll talk about that in person with you guys. But generally not really that wonderful. But you'll probably run into folks saying Jesus doesn't know who he is, and Jesus is slowly learning how to be God, and those kinds of ridiculous sort of slanders. That's not it at all. Jesus is trying to pace his ministry so he doesn't end up getting crucified at the wrong time. And when we get to the crucifixion, we'll talk about the timing of the crucifixion and why it needs to happen in a certain day, a certain time, a certain place. If you have been a Christian for very long, then you probably know all of this already, but there is a day and an hour that this is appointed for, and Jesus can't let that go. So that's what's going on in this little chunk. So we're going to move on to the next slide and see the next chunk. Okay, so as we get into this next section here, we have what again we think of as maybe some literary housekeeping as St. Peter through St. Mark name off the 12, and that's fine. Again, it gives us a little more space to breathe, but internally we're going to see that there's actually some good use for this time and a break, and it will reinforce the idea that Jesus is God and that give us a little bit of space for us to kind of mull over that former section about fasting. So here's the text. And Jesus went up on the mountain, and he called to him those whom he desired. And they came to him, and he appointed 12, whom he also named apostles, so that they might be with him, and that he might send them out to preach, and have authority to cast out demons. He appointed the 12, Simon, to whom he gave the name Peter, James the son of Zebedee, and John the brother of James, to whom he gave the name Boanerges, that is, the sons of thunder, Andrew and Philip and Bartholomew and Matthew and Thomas and James the son of Alphaeus and Thaddeus and Simon the Zealot and Judas Iscariot who betrayed him. Again, Mark 3:13 through 19 from the ESV. So credit there to the translators. So again, here we've got a nice little chunk, and we've got to name off the disciples. But here we're in the hinterlands of Galilee, and Jesus is going up on the mountain. So there are bigger hills that overlook the Sea of Galilee. They're not like Mount Everest. That's not what this is saying. This is saying, though, he's going up. And it's more important theologically than topographically. And what I mean by that is that in the Old Testament, you always go up to Jerusalem. And partially this is, again, topographically true, right? The roads go down into the valley and then up onto the little hill that is Jerusalem. But theologically, you're always going down and then up. And as you go up, you're going up to the house of God, up to where God lives. And so it's always going up to God. And so Jesus pulls back and goes up on the mountain, and this is going to prefigure a few different things for us. If you already know the story, which you all do, I think, this is going to prefigure the next time he's on the mountain, which is going to be transfiguration. It's going to prefigure the next time he's high and lifted up, which will be on the cross. And then it's going to prefigure the next time we see Jesus descending on the clouds or high and lifted up in the mountain, right, in the mountain of the Lord coming down onto Jerusalem. So all of those associations should be there when Jesus goes up on this mountain or this tall hill or whatever we're going to call this trip up. So he goes up to the mountain and he calls those whom he desired. That's a pretty decent translation there. Those whom he willed, or the people he really wanted there. And they came to him. This calling, though, is not a, hey, y'all get over here. This calling has a sense of duty and appointment. And so they have been called and they respond and come up. And we know that because then in the next verse, it says, and in verse 14, it says, and he appointed 12. Appointed is fine. Consecrated would be a good Old Testament word. Ordained might be a good word, especially if you're Roman Catholic and like the idea of the apostles as the 12 being the ambassadors of Christ and the church being founded on the apostles and all of those entailments. But it's a religious service, and the language here is that he calls these people up in solemnity and he consecrates them or appoints them, or for a quick and dirty translation is just makes them apostles. But we need to look at apostleship for a minute because apostleship is sort of, we don't really have this too much. We do in the government, we have the ambassadors, and they're allowed to speak officially for our government. And we have the ambassador in chief, who's in charge of all the ambassadors, the Secretary of State. And if the local ambassador to your country isn't going to work out, we will send the big time ambassador, namely the Secretary of State. But they're authorized to speak for the president and for the government and to enter into binding agreements with governments and the whole 9 yards. We might be able, if you have durable power of attorney for somebody, you're an apostle for them. That's the level of thing. Or if we kind of have this commonly for married couples, you can sign each other's checks, you can go and speak for each other at the doctor's office if you fill out the right HIPAA paperwork. All those things are entailed in apostleship. The other part is apostello is the Greek verb. That's where we get our word for apostle. Apostello is the word for to be sent out. So you don't have the ambassadors. They don't live in Washington, D.C. They might travel back to Washington, D.C. from time to time to meet with the government and to get further training and to have parties and those sorts of things. Especially they might travel with the entourage of the foreign government they represent. But really, you're sent out and you stay. So if the president makes you the ambassador to Zimbabwe, you're going to live in Zimbabwe until either he asks for your resignation or the next administration comes and they might just leave you there if you're okay with it, or if it's working out. And so the idea with apostello and apostles is you're sent out with authority. So this is going to redouble down on that Jesus is God. He needs apostellos. He needs apostles. And you only need apostellos or apostles if you're going to go, if you're in charge, if you have authority, if you're going to try to spread the ministry. And we already saw that people are flocking into Jesus in the last section from all over the place, the 4 points of the compass. Now there's this hint that Jesus is going to then send apostles out and double down on the ministry, right? And we know this historically from Acts. We know this historically from the early church, that these apostles then do go out to the four corners of the Western world and do all of this work for Jesus, and essentially found the church that we have today and know and love. So that's there running along behind, right? And so we have this cast of apostles, the 12 who he's close to, and they will just kind of be ever present throughout the rest of the gospel of Mark and any gospel. And then we have a bigger group of disciples. And then we've got another bigger group of people who hang on Jesus and listen to him, but who are not quite believers yet. So it's starting to ripple out. And then at the far ripple is those people who know him and don't like him, who are antagonistic to him. And so these folks would be the chief priests and the teachers of the law, the scribes and the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the Herodians, and potentially the Romans. So, you know, we've got these spheres of influence and the sphere of groups of different ripples out. And so this is the most close. And later on we'll see Peter, James, and John becoming the inner circle and seeming to have just interpersonally hit it off with Jesus. They seem to be his friends, those three. And that's sort of a affirmation of Jesus' human side, that he does have friends. And it's 12's kind of a big crowd, so Peter, James, and John are closer to him, it seems. Although they have different takes, and we'll see that here in a second. So we have the list of characters, the same list in all the Gospels. I will take a moment to point out this points to the historicity of the Gospels, right? They are historically reliable in the people that they name as apostles. This isn't going to change. There's not dispute. And so we have this, we know these guys, and we wrote their names down because everybody in the ancient world in the early church knows them or needs to know them. And so that becomes kind of an issue later on too. Okay, so then I want to take just a minute at the very end to talk about verse 19. So verse 19, Judas Iscariot, who betrayed him. So Mark's gospel assumes you know the Jesus story in broad strokes, that you know he's a great teacher who was killed, and that there was some betrayal, that you might already know some of this out there. So again, it's early, but word of mouth travels very quickly, and gospels take a little bit of time to write. But I bring this up because Peter and John have a different relationship with Judas. Peter seems to just, kind of deal with him in passing. He's the one who betrayed the Christ, and he's not a nice guy. John takes Judas's betrayal personally, and John spends time talking about how terrible Judas was. Probably because John is one of Jesus' friends, tight friends, and is personally hurt by Judas's betrayal. And so in John's gospel, if you wander over there, and I'm bringing this up because it's toward the end of Lent, Sunday's going to be Palm Sunday. If you're listening to this later, that's where we are in the midst of the coronavirus epidemic. It's March 31st. When this is being recorded. But I bring this up because they deal with Judas differently. So there's just kind of a passing Judas, the guy who betrayed Jesus, as opposed to other Judases, and his name does come up. There's some other Judases, and we don't want them to be confused for each other. But John takes these attacks personally. So if you're starting to ramp up for the Passion of our Lord Jesus, and you're reading through, a lot of the Passion accounts come from John's Gospel, And John makes no bones about how terrible Judas is. It's from John that we find out that Judas was the treasurer and that he had his hand in the till, as it were, or that he'd been embezzling. And it's John's gospel that fills in some of those details about Judas. So Peter and Mark just kind of leave him be and don't really worry too much about it. His betrayal is a fact, and that's how they're going to deal with it, where John is going to be much heavier handed with this. But overall, this text here sets up and finally reinforces again that Jesus is God because he needs to have an entourage. He needs to have people who are publicly sent out from him, who are authorized to do these things, as to preach, to cast out demons, to heal, and we'll see them do that with problems later on in the text. So I think that's going to wrap it up here because, and I know we only did 2 texts, but Jesus and Beelzebub is a bigger chunk with Jesus's mom and brothers at the end of chapter 3, and then Jesus starts real teaching with parables later on. So we'll actually need to talk again about parables as we get going here. So hopefully this has worked and it works well, and we'll look for comments to see how this went for you later on. So God's blessings on your day, and we will end it here.